All right, shalom, shalom, shalom. This is your Akazaki Yahoo. And I start this broadcast as I would start any broadcast by first of all giving all praises, honor, and great esteem unto the Most High Power, Yahuwah Bahashim, Yahushua HaMashiach, and to the 12 tribes of Israel who were scattered to the four quarters of the earth. I say, Shalom Wa Baruchi. That is peace and blessings. And I cannot wait to the day that the Most High brings us back together, and we are once again 12 tribes, one family, one nation, under the Most High Power, under one covenant, and back in our own land with a heart of flesh and no more a heart of stone. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
I'm joined this evening by my most esteemed Akinanaya. Shalom, Aki.
Hey, shalom, shalom, Aki. Shalom, shalom, Yasharal. Call Halal Yahweh, Bahashem, Hamashiach Yahweh Shah, Wa Muhammalak, Barakatham.
Hallelujah. All praises to Yahweh in the name of his beloved son, Yahweh Shah, the Messiah and King. Bless you. Hallelujah. Praises to the Father. We are going to get directly into the video. We've got a couple of videos to run from our good brothers over at Black Journals. And I did not put the links in the description box, but I will here while the videos run. So let's get to it and let's get through it. Praises to the Abba. May he be magnified in all that we do and pleased with the work. Shout out to Black Journals for videos and information to review. Here we go.
Like books on a shelf, chained together such that if a slave died, the corpse could remain in the hold for hours, still chained to other living people. When not in chains, many were beaten and forced to dance on deck for an hour a day to keep them fit. Additional account had it that the captain ordered the slaves killed in 3 batches. Dead by malnutrition or starvation, poor health or inhumane conditions, or sheer wicked cold-blooded murder, their corpses were thrown overboard into the sea for sea animals to feast on. These were the fate of scores of African slaves on the infamous Zong ship from Africa to Jamaica. The slave trade is estimated to have forced 15 million or more people from Africa to provide enslaved labor in the Caribbean and Americas. Over 2 million African people are thought to have died on the journey across the Atlantic. However, the slave trade brought vast wealth to Britain and was allowed to continue for hundreds of years. Among those estimated to have died en route on the Atlantic were the enslaved blacks on the infamous Zong ship. The event, which has come to be known as the Zong black slaves mass killing, did not become famous for the inhumane treatments and killing of the slaves, but for money expected from insurance claims and the resultant legal proceedings. Join us as we have a glimpse into yet another incident in the history of the slave trade era. How inconsequential the lives of enslaved Africans meant next to nothing to Europeans and especially British slavers. Before we go forward, support our work by kindly hitting the thumb button, share with friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and subscribe to stay with us for more interesting and revealing videos. The slave ship Zong departed the coast of Africa on 6th of September 1781 with 470 slaves. Since this human chattel was such a valuable commodity at that time, many captains took on more slaves than their ships could accommodate in order to maximize profits. The Zong's captain, Luke Collingwood, overloaded his ship with slaves, and by 29 November, many of them had begun to die from disease and malnutrition. The Zong then sailed in an area in the mid-Atlantic known as the doldrums, because of periods of little or no wind. As the ship sat stranded, sickness caused the deaths of 7 of the 17 crew members and over 50 slaves. Increasingly desperate, Collingwood decided to jettison some of the cargo in order to save the ship and provide the ship owners the opportunity to claim for the loss on their insurance. Over the next week, the remaining crew members threw 132 slaves who were sick and dying over the side. Another 10 slaves threw themselves overboard in what Collingwood later described as an act of defiance. Upon the Zong's arrival in Jamaica, James Gregson, the ship's owner, filed an insurance claim for their loss. Gregson argued that the Zong did not have enough water to sustain both crew and the human commodities. The insurance underwriter, Thomas Gilbert, disputed the claim citing that the Zong had 420 gallons of water aboard when she was inventoried in Jamaica. Despite this, the Jamaican court in 1782 found in favor of the owners. The insurers appealed the case in 1783, and in the process provoked a great deal of public interest and the attention of Great Britain's abolitionists. The leading abolitionist at the time, Granville Sharp, used the deaths of the slaves to increase public awareness about the slave trade and further the anti-slavery cause. It was he who first used the word massacre. Publicity surrounding the first case led William Murray, the Earl of Mansfield, and the Lord Chief Justice of the King's Bench, the highest court in Great Britain, to order a second trial. Mansfield presided and ruled in favor of the insurers. He also held that the cargo had been poorly managed, as the captain should have made a suitable allowance of water for each slave. Sharp attempted to have criminal charges brought against the captain, crew, and the owners, but was unsuccessful. Great Britain's the Solicitor General, Justice John Lee, however, refused to take up the criminal charges, claiming, "What is this claim that human people have been thrown overboard? This is a case of chattels or goods. Blacks are goods and property. It is madness to accuse these well-serving honorable men of murder. The case is the same as if wood had been thrown overboard." Although those who were responsible for the Zong mass killing were never brought to justice, the event was instrumental to successful campaigns to have Parliament abolish slavery throughout the British Empire in 1833. The voyage from Africa to the New World of the Americas was called the Middle Passage. Slave ships usually took between 6 and 11 weeks to complete the voyage. Slave ships made large profits by carrying as many slaves as possible across the Atlantic to sell at auction. There were two methods of loading the ship. Tight pack. This method involved packing as many enslaved people into the hold as possible. It was expected that some would die, but a large number would survive the voyage. A ship's hold was cramped, only 5 feet high, with a shelf running round the edge to carry yet more enslaved people. People were loaded in so close together that one captain described them as being like books on a shelf. Loose pack. Fewer enslaved people were loaded, giving them more space to lie out. More enslaved people survived the voyage, so less money was lost. In the case of the Zong ship, the loading was worse than tight. The enslaved cargo was cramped beyond capacity. Enslaved people were chained and movement was restricted. They were unable to go to the toilet and had to lie in their own filth. Sickness quickly spread. Also, they were all chained together. If a slave died, the body could remain in the hold for hours, still chained to other living slaves. The state of the hold would quickly become unbearable, dark, stuffy, and stinking. Aside from the heat and the foul air, there could be so little oxygen that a candle would not burn. Then, there were the challenges with food. African people were often unable to digest the food carried by the European crew, making the sickness worse. Many weakened quickly and died. Enslaved people who became sick were often denied food and left to die, not to mention the high level of mistreatment and humiliation. The crew's treatment of enslaved people was often horrific. Women could be subject to rape. Enslaved people were sometimes forced to dance on deck for an hour a day to keep them fit. Any resistance was dealt with harshly by floggings from the crew. Some enslaved people chose to take their own lives, sometimes by throwing themselves overboard, rather than endure such brutal treatment. Sickness on board a slave ship would often spread to the crew as well, killing many. The death rate among the enslaved people, however, was horrific. It is estimated that 15 to 16% of enslaved people died on the Middle Passage. This has been a regular occurrence but never made headlines until the Zong sail, thanks to the legal fireworks. When Zong sailed from Accra with 442 slaves on 18th of August 1781, it had taken on more than twice the number of people that it could safely transport. In the 1780s, British-built ships typically carried 1.75 slaves per ton of the ship's capacity. On the Zong, the ratio was 4.0 per ton. A British slave ship of the period would carry around 193 slaves, and it was extremely unusual for a ship of Zong's relatively small size to carry so many. After taking on drinking water at Sao Tome, Zong began its voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to Jamaica on 6th of September 1781. On 18 or 19th November, the ship neared Tobago in the Caribbean, but failed to stop there to replenish its water supplies. It is unclear who, if anyone, was in charge of the ship at this point, as Collingwood had been gravely ill for some time. The man who would normally have replaced him, First Mate James Kelsall, had been suspended from duty following an argument on 14th November. Stubbs had captained a slave ship several decades earlier, and he temporarily commanded Zong during Collingwood's incapacitation, but he was not a registered member of the vessel's crew. According to the historian James Walvin, the breakdown of the command structure on the ship might explain the subsequent navigational errors and the absence of checks on supplies of drinking water. On 27 or 28 November, the crew sighted Jamaica at a distance of 27 nautical miles, 50 kilometers, 31 miles, but misidentified it as the French colony of Saint-Domingue on the island of Hispaniola. Zong continued on its westward course, leaving Jamaica behind. This mistake was recognized only after the ship was 300 miles, 480 kilometers, leeward of the island. Overcrowding, malnutrition, accidents, and disease had already killed several mariners and approximately 62 Africans. Kelsall later claimed that there was only 4 days' water remaining on the ship when the navigational error was discovered, and Jamaica was still 10 to 13 sailing days away. If the slaves died on shore, the Liverpool ship owners would have had no redress from their insurers. Similarly, if they died a natural death, as the contemporary term put it, at sea, then insurance could not be claimed. If some enslaved people were thrown overboard to save the rest of the cargo or the ship, then a claim could be made under general average. This principle holds that a captain who jettisons part of his cargo to save the rest can claim for the loss from his insurers. The ship's insurance covered the loss of slaves at £30 per person. Let's leave you to guess which of the three options would top the list of a profiteer, especially in that era. On 29th November, the crew assembled to consider the proposal that some of the slaves should be thrown overboard. Kelsall later claimed that he had disagreed with the plan at first, but it was soon unanimously agreed upon. On 29th November, 54 women and children were thrown through cabin windows into the sea. On 1st of December, 42 male slaves were thrown overboard, and 36 more followed in the next few days. Another 10, in a display of defiance at the inhumanity of the slavers, chose to commit suicide by jumping into the sea. Having heard the shrieks of the victims as they were thrown into the water, one of the captives requested the remaining of them be denied food and drink, rather than being thrown into the sea. The crew ignored this request. In total, 142 Africans were killed by the time the ship reached Jamaica. The account of the King's Bench trial reports that one slave managed to climb back onto the ship after being thrown into the water. The crew claimed that the Africans had been jettisoned because the ship did not have enough water to keep them all alive for the rest of the voyage. This claim was later disputed, as the ship had 420 imperial gallon, that is 1/900 liter, of water left when it finally arrived in Jamaica on 22nd December. An affidavit later made by Kelsall stated that on 1st December, when 42 slaves were killed, it rained heavily for more than a day, allowing 6 casks of water, sufficient for 11 days, to be collected. On 22nd December 1781, Zong arrived at Black River, Jamaica, with 208 slaves on board, less than half the number taken from Africa. The survivors were sold into slavery in January 1782. These people were sold for an average price of £36 per person. The Jamaican Vice Admiralty Court upheld the legality of the British capture of Zong from the Dutch, and the syndicate renamed the ship Richard of Jamaica. Collingwood died 3 days after Zong reached Jamaica, 2 years before the 1783 court proceedings about the case. A quick digression to the background of the ownership of the Zong ship, her crew, and circumstances to give you insight and provide clarity on the rest of the event. Zong was originally named Zorg, meaning care in Dutch, by its owners, the Middelburgsche Commercie Compagnie. It operated as a slave ship based in Middelburg, Netherlands, and made a voyage in 1777, delivering enslaved Africans to the Dutch colony of Suriname in South America. Zong was a square-stern ship of 110 tons burden. The British 16-gun brig HMS Alert captured it as part of the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War on 10 February 1781. On 26 February, Alert and Zong arrived at Cape Coast Castle in what is now Ghana. Cape Coast Castle was maintained and staffed along with other forts and castles by the Royal African Company, RAC, which used the castle as its regional headquarters. In early March 1781, the master of William purchased Zong on behalf of a syndicate of Liverpool merchants, which included Edward Wilson, George Case, James Aspinall, and William, James, and John Gregson. William Gregson had an interest in 50 slaving voyages between 1747 and 1780. He also served as mayor of Liverpool in 1762. By the end of his life, vessels in which Gregson had a financial stake had carried 58,000 Africans to slavery in the Americas. Zong was paid for with bills of exchange, and the 244 slaves already on board were part of the transaction. The ship was not insured until after it started its voyage. The insurers, another syndicate from Liverpool, underwrote the ship and its slaves for up to £8,000, approximately half the slaves' potential market value. The remaining risk was borne by the owners. Now this is where our digression gets interesting. Zong was the first command of Luke Collingwood, formerly the surgeon on the William. While Collingwood lacked experience in navigation and command, ship's surgeons were typically involved in selecting captured Africans for purchase, so their medical expertise supported the determination of commodity value for a captive. If the surgeon rejected a captive, that individual suffered commercial death, being of no value, and was liable to be killed by the African traders. Sometimes these killings happened in the presence of the surgeon. It is therefore likely that Collingwood had already witnessed the mass killing of slaves. Historian Jeremy Crickler commented that this may have prepared him psychologically to condone the mass killing that later took place on the Zong. Zong's first mate was James Kelsall, who had also served on the William. The vessel's only passenger, Robert Stubbs, was a former captain of slave ships. Stubbs, who had earlier been accused of being a semi-literate drunkard, was aboard to return to Britain. However, Collingwood may have thought his earlier experience on slave ships would be useful. Zong had a 17-man crew when it left Africa, which was far too small to maintain adequate sanitary conditions on the ship. Mariners willing to risk disease and rebellions on slave ships were difficult to recruit within Britain and were harder to find for a vessel captured from the Dutch off the coast of Africa. Zong was manned with remnants of the previous Dutch crew, the crew of William, and with unemployed sailors hired from settlements along the African coast. After the slaver ship reached port at Black River, Jamaica, Zong's owners made a claim to their insurers for the loss of the enslaved Africans. When the insurers refused to pay, the resulting court cases, Gregson versus Gilbert, 1783, 3 Doug KB 232, held that in some circumstances the murder of enslaved Africans was legal and that insurers could be required to pay for those who had died. The jury found for the slavers, but at a subsequent appeal, hearing the judges, led by Lord Chief Justice, the Earl of Mansfield, ruled against the slave trading syndicate owners on the grounds that new evidence suggested that the captain and crew were at fault. Following the first trial, Olaudah Equiano, a freedman, brought news of the mass killing to the attention of the anti-slavery campaigner Granville Sharp, who worked unsuccessfully to have the ship's crew prosecuted for murder. Because of the legal dispute, reports of the mass killing received increased publicity, stimulating.
Con, go ahead.
So that Gustavus Equinagos, you know who that is? That's an Igbo brother who wrote a book, an autobiography. It's actually one of the early accounts of our people being the Israelites. You know, he wrote in his book about the customs of his people and how it was all resembled that of the Bible.
Okay.
It's just that's wild how they've got him on here. It doesn't seem like they're going to mention any of that, but that's indeed who that is.
Say his name again?
And I mispronounced it, but Gustavo Equinox. Aloide Gustavos Equinocos or Exquanos or something like that.
Con. Yeah. I remember him now. Is what he said. The way he said it, I didn't recognize it, but Yeah, Khan. Yeah. He is because he was brought over here, and when they were reading, they were like, that's my people. Yeah, he was. I remember
Right.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, Kyle.
Okay. Yeah. They didn't mention that, and that's ironic that they don't go into that as they should, and put that on the table. So that's definitely a missed opportunity. But I'm glad you caught that out because it went right over me, and I'm sharing through these other platforms. That's what I was tied up. So
Okay.
let's get back to it.
The abolitionist movement in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Zong events were increasingly cited as a powerful symbol of the horrors of the Middle Passage, the transoceanic route by which enslaved Africans were brought to the New World. When news of the Zong massacre reached Great Britain, the ship's owners claimed compensation from their insurers for the loss of the slaves. The insurers refused to honor the claim, and the owners took them to court. Zong's logbook went missing after the ship reached Jamaica, 2 years before the hearing started. As such, the legal proceedings provide almost all the documentary evidence about the mass unaliving, though there is no formal record of the first trial, other than what is referred to in the subsequent appeals hearing. The ship's insurers claimed that the log had been deliberately destroyed, which the Gregson Syndicate denied. Almost all the surviving source material is of questionable reliability. The two witnesses who gave evidence, Stubbs and Kelsall, were strongly motivated to exonerate themselves from blame. It is possible that the figures concerning the number of people killed, the amount of water that remained on the ship, and the distance beyond Jamaica that Zong had mistakenly sailed are inaccurate. It's worthy of mention that at this period in time, only full-status British citizens can stand to give evidence. The first legal proceedings began when the insurers refused to compensate the owners of Zong. The dispute was initially tried at the Guildhall in London on 6 March 1783, with the Lord Chief Justice, the Earl of Mansfield, overseeing the trial before a jury. Mansfield was previously the judge in Somerset's case in 1772, which concerned the legality of enslaving people in Britain. He had ruled on that previous case that slavery had never been established by statute in Britain and was not supported by common law. Stubbs was the only witness in the first Zong trial, and the jury found in favor of the owners, under an established protocol in maritime insurance that considered slaves as cargo. On 19th March 1783, Olaudah Equiano, a former slave, told the anti-slave trade activist Granville Sharp of the events aboard Zong, and a newspaper soon carried a lengthy account, reporting that the captain had ordered the slaves killed in 3 batches. Sharp sought the possibility of prosecuting the crew for murder. The insurers applied to the Earl of Mansfield to have the previous verdict set aside and for the case to be tried again. A hearing was held at the Court of King's Bench in Westminster Hall on 21st to 22nd May, 1783, before Mansfield and 2 other King's Bench judges, Mr. Justice Buller and Mr. Justice Wills. The Solicitor General, John Lee, appeared on behalf of the Zong's owners, as he had done previously in the Guildhall trial. Sharp was also in attendance, together with the secretary he had hired to take a written record of the proceedings. Summing up the verdict reached in the first trial, Mansfield said that the jury had no doubt that the case of slaves was the same as if horses had been thrown overboard. Isn't this very much unbelievable? He went further that the question was whether there was not an absolute necessity for throwing them overboard to save the rest. The jury were of opinion there was. Collingwood had died in 1781, and the only witness of the mass killing to appear at Westminster Hall was again Stubbs, although a written affidavit by First Mate Kelsall was made available to the lawyers. Stubbs claimed that there was an absolute necessity for throwing over the Negroes, because the crew feared all the slaves would die if they did not throw some into the sea. The insurers argued that Collingwood had made a blunder and mistake in sailing beyond Jamaica, and that slaves had been killed so their owners could claim compensation. They alleged that Collingwood did this because he did not want his first voyage as a slave ship captain to be unprofitable. Lee responded by saying that the slaves perished just as a cargo of goods perished and were jettisoned for the greater good of the ship. The insurers' lawyers replied that Lee's argument could never justify the killing of innocent people. Each of the 3 addressed issues of humanity in the treatment of the slaves and said that the actions of Zong's crew were nothing less than murder. At the hearing, new evidence was heard that heavy rain had fallen on the ship on the second day of the killings, but still a third batch of slaves was killed. This led Mansfield to order another trial, because the rainfall meant that the killing of those people, after the water shortage had been eased, could not be justified in terms of the greater necessity of saving the ship and the rest of the slaves aboard. One of the judges also said that this evidence invalidated the findings of the jury in the first trial, as the jury had heard testimony that the water shortage resulted from the poor condition of the ship, brought on by unforeseen maritime conditions, rather than from errors committed by its captain. Mansfield concluded that the insurers were not liable for losses resulting from errors committed by Zong's crew. There is no evidence that another trial was held on this issue. Despite Sharp's efforts, no member of the crew was prosecuted for murder. Even so, the Zong case did eventually gain both national and international attention. Jeremy Crickler has argued that Mansfield wanted to ensure that commercial law remained as helpful to Britain's overseas trade as possible, and as a consequence was keen to uphold the principle of general average, even in relation to the killing of humans. For Mansfield to have found in favor of the insurers would have greatly undermined this idea. The revelation that rain had fallen during the period of the killings enabled Mansfield to order a retrial, while leaving the notion of general average intact. He emphasized that the mass killing would have been legally justified, and the owner's insurance claim would have been valid if the water shortage had not arisen from mistakes made by the captain. Crickler comments that Mansfield's conclusions ignored the ruling precedent of his predecessor, Sir Matthew Hale, that the killing of innocents in the name of self-preservation was unlawful. This ruling was to prove important a century later in R.V. Dudley and Stevens, which also concerned the justifiability of acts of murder at sea. Mansfield also failed to acknowledge another important legal principle, that no insurance claim can be legal if it arose from an illegal act. It was as a result of these mass deaths and nonchalance by the slavers, knowing that their losses would be covered by insurance, that led to the legislation of the Slave Trade Act, 1788, Dolben's Act. In 1788, British MP William Dolben put forward a bill to regulate conditions on board slave ships. He described horrors of enslaved people chained hand and foot, stowed like herrings in a barrel, and stricken with putrid and fatal disorders. The Slave Trade Act, 1788, was passed and controlled the number of captives a ship was permitted to carry, according to its weight. Dolben's Act also ordered all slave ships to carry a doctor who had to keep records about the enslaved Africans on board. These doctors received bonuses according to the number of Africans who survived the journey. Conditions, however, remained appalling. The Non-Denominational Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded in 1787. The next year, Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, 1788, its first law regulating the slave trade to limit the number of slaves per ship. Then, in 1791, Parliament prohibited insurance companies from reimbursing ship owners when enslaved Africans were murdered by being thrown overboard. Granville Sharp campaigned to raise awareness of the mass killing, writing letters to newspapers, the Lords Commissioners of Admiralty, and the Prime Minister, the Duke of Portland. Neither Portland nor the Admiralty sent him a reply. Only one London newspaper reported the first Zong trial in March 1783, but it provided details of events. The newspaper article in March 1783 was the first public report of the mass killing, and it was published nearly 18 months after the event. Little else about the event appeared in print before 1787. Despite these setbacks, Sharp's efforts did have some success. In April 1783, he sent an account of the Zong slave ship event to William Dillwyn, a Quaker, who had asked to see evidence that was critical of the slave trade. The London yearly meeting of the Society of Friends decided shortly after to begin campaigning against slavery, and a petition signed by 273 Quakers was submitted to Parliament in July 1783. Sharp also sent letters to Anglican bishops and clergy, and to those already sympathetic to the abolitionist cause. The immediate effect of the Zong mass killings on public opinion was limited, demonstrating, as the historian of abolitionism Seymour Drescher has noted, the challenge that the early abolitionists faced. Following Sharp's efforts, the Zong mass killings became an important topic in abolitionist literature, and the Cold Murders was discussed in works by Thomas Clarkson, Ottobah Cugoano, James Ramsey, and John Newton. These accounts often omitted the names of the ship and its captain, thereby creating, in the words of Srividya Swaminathan, a portrait of abuse that could be mapped onto any ship in the Middle Passage. The Zong killings offered a powerful example of the horrors of the slave trade, stimulating the development of the abolitionist movement in Britain, which dramatically expanded in size and influence in the late 1780s. In 1787, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded. Parliament received numerous petitions against the slave trade and examined the issue in 1788. With strong support by Sir William Dolben, who had toured a slave ship, it passed the Slave Trade Act, 1788, Dolben's Act, which was its first legislation to regulate the slave trade. It restricted the number of slaves that could be transported to reduce problems of overcrowding and poor sanitation. Its renewal in 1794 included an amendment that limited the scope of insurance policies concerning slaves, rendering illegal such generalized phrases that promised to insure against all other perils, losses, and misfortunes. The Zong owners' representatives had highlighted such a phrase in seeking their claim at the King's Bench hearing. The act had to be renewed annually, and Dolben led these efforts, speaking frequently to Parliament in opposition to slavery. The Slave Trade Act 1799 was passed to make these provisions permanent. Abolitionists, notably William Wilberforce, continued their effort to end the slave trade. Britain passed the Slave Trade Act 1807, which prohibited the Atlantic slave trade, and the Royal Navy enforced the blockade of Africa. The United States also prohibited the Atlantic slave trade in 1808 and helped intercept illegal slave ships at sea, predominantly after 1842. In 1823, the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery throughout the British Dominions, known as the First Anti-Slavery Society, was founded in Britain, dedicated to abolishing slavery throughout the British Empire. The Slavery Abolition Act 1833 represented the achievement of their goal. The Zong mass killings was frequently cited in abolitionist literature, with its many allusions to the slave trade in Antigua. The 1839 edition of Clarkson's book had an important influence on the artist J.M.W. Turner, who displayed a painting at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition in 1840 entitled The Slave Ship. The painting depicts a vessel from which a number of manacled slaves have been thrown into the sea to be devoured by sharks. Some of the details in the painting, such as the shackles worn by the slaves, appear to have been influenced by the illustrations in Clarkson's book. The painting was shown at an important time in the movement to abolish slavery in the world, as the Royal Academy exhibition opened 1 month before the First World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. The mass killing has inspired works of art and literature. It was remembered in London in 2007, among events to mark the bicentenary of the British Slave Trade Act 1807, which abolished British participation in the African slave trade, though stopped short of outlawing slavery. A monument to the murdered enslaved Africans on Zong was later installed at Black River, Jamaica.
Man, that was hard, to say the least. Difficult and harmful. I mean, whew, truthfully. And man, you know, we got to touch on this history. And the reason we got to touch on this history is because it's our history. If we don't touch on it, who gonna touch on it? You know, who gonna follow our narrative unless we do it? You know, as painful, as hard as it was to stomach and to try to, you know, put that in your spirit. This is a reality that our people face. And here's the crazy thing. All of us, we are the descendants of those that made it. You know, we didn't descend from the ones that didn't make it. The ones that didn't make it were gone before they ever got here. We come from those that made it. And that's miraculous to think about. Because I mean, how many he say was being lost on the way out, on the voyage, on the kidnapping?
Yeah, come.
On the theft. I mean, whew, man, that is some hard reality, to deal with. But that's our reality. That's who we are. That's where we came from. And this is all because the Most High, we went against him. We went against our power. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's definitely a good way for me to chime in and land back off of what you were saying. The Most High says a thing, that thing's for sure. Like it's surely gonna happen. So not only in the but I know for sure in the book of Jeremiah, the Most High talks about how his people are going to perish, and he says by the sword. He says by famine and by pestilence and captivity.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm looking at clips of some of our ancestors on these slave boats.
Mm-hmm.
And would you believe that all of those circumstances are going on that slave boat? You've got the sword, you've got pestilence, you've got famine, and you've got captivity.
Yeah.
It's the Most High's word is infallible, and it blows my mind how accurate he is, and it really shouldn't, he's proven himself,
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's a magnificent point as well. It's and it's so true at the same time, but it's painful. It's painful and it hurts, but it shows us, this is not the power that you mess with. This is not the power you play around with. This power is for real, and he's so for real. And I'm not being funny when I say that. I mean, he is authentically for real, and so we got to learn from that, and we got to get our minds right, and we got to serve him with a whole heart. Because if we don't serve him with a whole heart, then we playing ourselves. So, all right, we got another video for you, and I got bad news. This video is not going to be much better as far as the hardness of it, as the harshness of it. It's going to be another hard video, but we need to know these things. We need to understand these things. This is what our people endured to get us here. And when you turn on social media today, and when you see how our people behave in the streets, in front of cameras, in front of camera phones, and it is just appalling that our people would go through all that they went through to get us here, go through everything that happened, and as a result, I mean, just a few generations later, now our people just act so ridiculous. So let's go ahead to the video, and we'll continue as we get through it. Here we go.
Rufus landed hard on the dirt floor.
Slacky, my bad. The name of this video is Trapped in Chains, The Untold Pain of Black Male Slaves. All right, so that's going to tell you it's not going to be an easy video either. So here we go.
Rose's kick had caught him off guard when she fought him. He had wanted to lie down. He was exhausted. The Texas sun had drained his energies. He then knew that Rose and he wouldn't sleep together that night, but he knew they would eventually have to. It was how things worked under slavery. Some called him a bully, but he knew who held the real power. Some days before, Rufus's master had told him that it was time for him to make babies. The master told him to pair up with Rose, another slave like himself. Rufus didn't know her well, but had seen her around, working, not who he would have picked. He liked another young woman. But in this life, you did as you were told, or you paid the consequences. Rufus was no stranger to being told what to do with his body. Lift this, carry that, sleep here, move now, sleep with her, and make babies. He hated his master for telling him whom to have sex with, but he knew he had no choice. He'd been poked, prodded, stripped, whipped, leered at, and now mated. At times, he wondered if they even knew he was a man. Life with Rose would work out. It was better than getting lashed for resisting. And he had wanted to have children someday and head a household. But for now, he found himself on a dirt floor, tasting blood and faced with a woman wielding a fireplace poker. Tonight, he would sleep outside. And, as the saying goes, Rufus was caught between a rock and a hard place. Male slave owners used sexual assault to dominate, dehumanize, and emasculate male slaves in American antebellum South. The oppression and violence that characterized the institution of chattel slavery are easily accessible, as well as the sexual assault often inflicted on female slaves. Although many slave narratives and journals address female rape and other forms of sexual assault, the abuse endured by male slaves has been grossly overlooked. The intention of this video is not to discredit the suffering of female slaves, but the research suggested that the same use of sexual assault as a form of discipline and control was applied to male slaves, and even worse. There is a general consensus that only women were subjected to the violently lustful assaults of slave owners. A closer analysis of the narratives of Olaudah Equiano, Harriet Jacobs, and Frederick Douglass.
There go the brother. That was him. Olaudah Equiano. Is that who we mentioned?
Yeah, Khan. That's the same brother.
Same brother. Okay, Khan. Yeah, that's how I recognize his name. I was, like I said, I was sharing those other videos. I was sharing those other platforms, and I probably wasn't paying as close attention as I should have. Plus, again, that was a hard video to watch. But and I'm not making excuses. I'm not saying I'm showing stuff that I'm not even watching. But I was preoccupied. So, but yeah, Khan, I'm familiar with this brother here, and the Yehuda brother. I'm trying to remember what his name mean. Didn't it say something about Judah or something?
Khan, I want to say that it is similar to I forget. To be honest with you, I'm looking at it and it does. I could see how somebody could say that it means Yehuda or something like that.
Khan. All right. Well, let's continue.
General consensus that only women were subjected to the violently lustful assaults of slave owners. A closer analysis of the narratives of Olaudah Equiano, Harriet Jacobs, and Frederick Douglass revealed the underlying issue that male slaves were going through similar situations. All of this was an attempt to increase American wealth through the forced labor of an entire race. In this video, we are taking you on a brief journey that would by all means humble you with reflection when you start to have a clue on what it feels like to be a black male slave. Before we go forward, support our work by kindly hitting the thumb button, share with friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and subscribe to stay with us for more interesting and revealing videos while you keep the channel growing. Now let us get back in. When many people hear of someone being abused, the first thing that comes to their mind is rape. So you may be wondering, can a man be raped? Do men get raped? The truth is, the historical abuses of especially black male slaves, by even white women elites, would forever be shocking. You don't want to go there. Tales of it are indeed so horrible, so nerve-wracking, that the most frightening horror movies would appear more like comedies in comparison. But in the almighty USA, male rape was not seen as an issue until recently, in the year 2012, when FBI's Uniform Crime Report redefined rape as the penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. The prior definition had not changed since 1927 and gained the attention of sexual assault awareness groups because it had alienated the victims who did not fit the definition, the carnal knowledge of a female, forcibly and against her will, with sole emphasis on female and vagina. While it is yet to be legislated in many top world countries, even in the United Kingdom previously, English law did not include rape of males as a criminal offense, and it was recorded as non-consensual buggery. A convicted rapist of a female could be imprisoned for life, stated Henry Leake, the chairman of Survivors Organization, while buggery, that is the rape of a male, only carried 10 years maximum as a sentence, until 2003 with the Sexual Offences Act, and in 2005 a further distinction between mouth, anus, or vagina when sentencing. Scotland and Northern Ireland Acts were, in 2009 and 2008, respectively recognized that men can be both perpetrators and victims. However, in all parts of the United Kingdom, a female cannot be legally charged with rape. She must be instead charged with other offenses, such as sexual assault, assault by penetration, or causing sexual activity without consent, of which the latter two carry the same maximum sentence. Following the trend, other countries like Nigeria has just amended her abuse and rape laws to include males this year, 2024. You would be surprised at the staggering statistics of male rape. As of 1998, 2.78 million men in the U.S. had been victims of attempted or completed rape. About 3% of American men, or 1 in 33, have experienced an attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. 1 out of every 10 rape victims are male. Despite this, historically, rape was thought to be and defined as a crime committed solely against females. This belief is still held in some parts of the world, but rape of males is now commonly criminalized and has been subject to more discussion than in the past. Males are far less likely to report sexual abuse than females. Rape of males is still taboo and has a negative connotation.
What's that? He does. Okay, I got you.
Among heterosexual and homosexual men. Community and service providers often react differently to male victims based on their sexual orientation and the gender of their perpetrators. It may be difficult for male victims to report a sexual assault they experienced, especially in a society with a strong masculine custom. They might be afraid that people will doubt their sexual orientation and label them homosexual, especially if raped by a male, or that they may be seen as unmasculine because they were a victim, and therefore many statistics underestimate how many males are raped due to their unwillingness to report sexual assault and rape. Most of the time, male victims try to hide and deny their victimization, similar to female victims, unless they have serious physical injuries. Eventually, the male victims may be very vague in explaining their injuries when they are seeking medical or mental health services, and we are talking of the 21st century. How much more of the slavery eras of 18th and 19th centuries? However, an abuse is beyond sexual assault or rape. We may have to do a deep dive into classifications of abuse later in the video. Meanwhile, let's run with this understanding. Now back to Rufus's experience. Many people may not be surprised at such abuse and mistreatment coming from a male slaver. But to think or imagine that the same and worse than that were done by white women, as slavers or such, would and should be unexpected. Sadly, there are records of many of these inhumane treatments on male slaves by white women. Many narratives regarding slavery tend to focus on the physical abuse of slaves, such as whippings, but do not focus on the sexual abuse that both female and male slaves suffered from. The sexual abuse that enslaved males and females faced was used as a weapon to control slaves physically and psychologically. Not discussing the sexual violence that whites perpetrated against enslaved peoples erases the horrific acts that were committed to them. The legacy of this often unspoken part of slavery has led to African American men and women to become hypersexualized in the United States. Black men are perceived as being sexual predators because they cannot control their sexual urges, and Black women are portrayed as being sexually promiscuous and therefore constantly looking for sexual partners. These racial and sexist stereotypes have not been recently constructed. There is a history behind them. When describing the physical attributes and the lives of Africans and Blacks, whites often compared them to animals, such as orangutans. By comparing Africans and Blacks to orangutans and claiming that they had sexual relations with them, white men believed that they did not need consent when engaging in sexual acts with their slaves. Since animals did not give consent to one another when breeding, African slaves and their descendants were to be treated in the same manner since they were considered to be animals themselves. Due to the animalistic comparisons between Africans and apes, Black women were considered to be sexually promiscuous, and therefore they could not be raped because it would be interpreted in court as them actively looking to have sexual relations with a man. Black men were also considered to be sexually promiscuous, which led to whites defining sexual assault as a violent incident if the perpetrator was Black. In contrast, sexual assault that was committed by a white person was deemed as a sexual act. With this assumption, white women slave owners tend to maximize their gains from their cartel slaves, especially male. And these white women slavers were in numbers. It's estimated that 40% of slave owners may have been white women. White women were active and violent participants in the slave market. They bought, sold, managed, and sought the return of enslaved people in whom they had a vested economic interest. Owning a large number of enslaved people made a woman a better marriage prospect. Once married, white women fought in courts to preserve their legal ownership over enslaved people, as opposed to their husband's ownership, and often won.
For them, slavery was their freedom.
Jones Rogers observes in her book. Jones Rogers argues that white women were actually trained to participate from a very young age.
Their exposure to the slave market is not something that begins in adulthood. It begins in their homes when they are little girls, sometimes infants, when they're given enslaved people as gifts.
She says, Jones Rogers shows that part of white children's training in plantation management involved beating enslaved people. And this was not without the least cruelty.
It didn't matter whether the child was large or small. They always beat you till the blood ran down.
One woman told the Works Progress Administration, WPA. One of such white women, Martha Gibbs, one of the richest women in Virginia, as at when she married George Washington in 1759, owned 84 enslaved people, while the husband, George, may have owned around 18 people by then. Martha was reported to have even taken enslaved people to Texas and forced them to work for her at gunpoint until 1866, a year after slavery's formal abolition. From accounts from one of Gibbs's former slaves, Lit Young, interviewed as part of the Federal Writers Project, FWP, of the Works Progress Administration, WPA, established by the Roosevelt administration in 1935.
Gibbs was a big, rich Irish woman who weren't scared of no man. She owned and operated a large steam sawmill on the Warner Bayou in Vicksburg, where it emptied into the Mississippi River.
Gibbs owned a significant number of slaves, so many, in fact, that she had to build 2 sets of whitewashed quarters with glass windows to house them all. She also built a nice church with glass windows and a brass cupolo for their worship. She fed them well, but she worked them hard too. In step with other slave owners throughout the South, Gibbs employed an overseer to make sure that the people she kept enslaved performed the tasks delegated to them. But she also oversaw her overseer. Almost every morning, she buckled on 2 guns and would come out to the place to personally ensure that things were running smoothly, and she outcussed a man when things didn't go right. Twice married and once widowed, Gibbs would not permit either of her husbands to interfere with her financial affairs, including the management of her slaves. Even though her second husband was a reputable physician in Vicksburg, he had little influence over her or the slave-related activities on their plantation. Lit Young remembered Gibbs's husband addressing her after witnessing the brutal whippings her overseer inflicted upon her slaves. He softly interjected,
"Darling, you ought not to whip them poor black folks so hard. They's going to be free just like us sometimes."
Shut up. Sometime I believe you as a Yankee anyway.
One day, when her husband had gone to buy corn for his livestock, she gathered up some of her slaves, 10 6-mule wagons, and 1 ox cook wagon, and set off with them. They walked about 215 miles from Vicksburg, Mississippi, to about 3 miles from Marshall, Texas. She hired Irishman guards with rifles to make sure that none of her freed slaves ran away during the journey, and when they stopped to rest, the guards tied the men to trees. Then on June 19, 1866, 1 year after these legally free but still enslaved people made her first crop in Texas, Martha Gibbs finally let them go. Another one of the white women slavers, and arguably the most notorious for her cruelty to black slaves, especially male, was Madame Blanc, or, after her 3rd marriage, Madame LaLaurie, born Marie Delphine McCarty on March 19, 1787 in New Orleans, Spanish Louisiana, was a New Orleans socialite and later would-be serial killer who was believed to have tortured and murdered a great number of enslaved people in her household mansion. Of the many investigations and cases of her cruelty, she most likely earned her notorious reputation for the incident reported in the New Orleans Bee of April 11, 1834. Bystanders responding to the fire attempted to enter the quarters of those enslaved to ensure that everyone had been evacuated. Upon being refused the keys by the LaLauries, the bystanders broke down the doors to the quarters and found 7 people, more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other, who claimed to have been imprisoned there for some months. One of those who entered the premises was Judge Jean-Francois J.F. Canonge, who said that, when he questioned LaLaurie's husband about those enslaved on the property, he was told in an insolent manner that some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business. A version of this story, circulating in 1836 and recounted by the historian Martineau, added that the enslaved people were emaciated, showed signs of being flayed with a whip, were bound in restrictive postures, and wore spiked iron collars which kept their heads in static positions. When the discovery of the abused and enslaved people became widely known, a mob of local citizens attacked the Royal Street mansion of Madame Lalaurie and demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. A sheriff and his officers were called to disperse the crowd, but by the time the mob left, the property had sustained major damage, with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. The vindicators were taken to a local jail, where they were available for public viewing. The Bee reported that by April 12th, up to 4,000 people had attended to view the slaves, to convince themselves of their sufferings. The Pittsfield Sun, citing the New Orleans Advertiser, and writing several weeks after the evacuation of LaLaurie's quarters of her victims, claimed that 2 of the enslaved people found in the mansion had died following their rescue. It added,
"We understand that in digging the yard, bodies have been disinterred, and the condemned well in the grounds of the mansion, having been uncovered, others, particularly that of a child, were found."
Madame LaLaurie fled New Orleans during the mob violence that followed the fire to evade justice, taking a coach to the waterfront and traveling by schooner to Mobile, Alabama, and then to Paris. She reportedly died in France under unclear circumstances. In 1888, George Washington Cable recounted a popular but unsubstantiated story that LaLaurie had died in France in a boar hunting accident. However, in the late 1930s, Eugene Bax, who served as sexton to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 until 1924, discovered an old cracked copper plate in Alley 4 of the cemetery. The inscription on the plate read, "Madame Lalaurie, née Marie Delphine McCarthy, décédée à Paris le 7 décembre 1842, à l'âge de 6. The English translation of the inscription reads, "Madame Lalaurie, born Marie Delphine McCarthy, died in Paris December 7, 1842, at the age of 6, meaning 60-something years." But according to the French Archives of Paris, LaLaurie died on December 7, 1849, at the age of 62. After 1945, accounts of those enslaved by the LaLauries became more explicit. John de Levine, writing in Ghost Stories of Old New Orleans, 1946, alleged that LaLaurie had a sadistic appetite that seemed never appeased until she had inflicted on one or more of her black servitors some hideous form of torture, and claimed that those who responded to the 1834 fire had found male slaves, stark naked, chained to the wall, their eyes gouged out, their fingernails pulled off by the roots. Others had their joints skinned and festering, great holes in their buttocks where the flesh had been sliced away, their ears hanging by shreds, their lips sewn together. Intestines were pulled out and knotted around naked waists. There were holes in the skulls, where a rough stick had been inserted to stir the brains. This is just crazy, and nothing short of the work of the mind of a twisted monster with neither humane upbringing nor indoctrination. However, has the act of slavery ever been civilized? Where's the so-called high-born in such barbarism? Nonetheless, to round up this section of the video, the height of abuse affected on black male slaves by white women was believed to have happened more than reported due to the peculiarities of the time. One of the few available public records of such occurrences was by the former slave Charles Ball in his 1837 autobiography, where he described meeting the daughter of a wealthy planter in one of the lower counties of Georgia, who had given birth to a mixed-race son. The family considered sending her out of state until the birth, but instead, the girl was kept in her father's house until the birth of her child, which she was not permitted to nurse, it being taken from her. She was degraded from her rank in society, and her child was sold into slavery. Sexual contact between white women and black men did occur in slaveholding societies, more often than perhaps many are aware. Here are some of the factors that did or may have contributed to the incidence of such relations. First, even though the sexuality of Southern white women was heavily regulated, women were not as entirely sexually repressed as one might assume. According to historian Elizabeth Fox Genovese, 1998, Slaveholding culture emphasized control of female sexuality. It did not deny its existence. She says that white women had a striking lack of neurotic inhibition. Like their husbands, Southern women had pre- and extramarital sex, though not as often. The dangers of having sexual relations with a black man rather than a white man were enormous in terms of the possibility of producing a mixed-race child. Although birth control and abortion methods in the 19th century were not as widely used, safe, or accessible as they are today, they, however, existed. Condoms made out of animal skin, membrane, oiled silk, and rubber were used along with other contraceptive techniques to prevent pregnancy. For much of the 19th century, abortion was largely unregulated, and it was not limited to poor, immigrant, or black women. Upper and middle-class white women, too, had abortions. This would have allowed white women to have affairs with black men with some level of confidence that they would not be caught. There is also a possibility that affairs between white women and slaves were simply not noticed or recorded as often as they occurred. While it may have been expected to a certain extent that white men would transgress morally, for example, by having sexual relations with slaves, a white woman choosing to have sex with a black man might not have been considered a likely occurrence. Additionally, an upper-class woman under suspicion of an affair with a slave could readily invoke images of chastity in order to allay trouble for herself, or in other words, accuse the slave of rape. Because black men, like black women, were seen as inherently lustful and prone to sexual vice, for an elite woman to have illicit sex with a black rather than a white man might have been a slightly safer bet. It was easier to blame a black man of rape than a white man. Why these women chose to sexually abuse slaves probably varied by situation. Perhaps some of them were simply bored or sexually frustrated, since many of their men were having their fill. It is possible the sexual exploitation of slaves by women who had little power in relation to white men was a source of enjoyment that created a feeling of power. White women whose affairs with slaves were made known faced varying degrees of public humiliation. When a planter's daughter or wife was discovered to be pregnant by a slave, great pains were taken to cover up the pregnancy. The resulting child might have been sold into slavery, but infanticide was not an uncommon means of avoiding scandal. Of course, scandal was not always avoided, as was in the case described by Charles Ball in his autobiography mentioned above. According to one historian, few scholars will have viewed the relationships of enslaved men and free white women through the lens of sexual abuse, in part because of gendered assumptions about sexual power. This is in keeping with both the standard feminist conceptualization of rape as a tool of patriarchal oppression, as well as the traditional, unfeminist notion of women as too weak, emotionally and physically, to commit serious crimes, let alone sexual abuse, and the idea that men cannot be raped. However, it is becoming increasingly clear that women too are capable of committing sexual offenses and using sex as a means of domination and control. Indeed, there is considerable documentation of white women forcing black men into having sexual relations. According to Captain Richard J. Hinton, an abolitionist commander in the Civil War,
I have never found a bright-looking colored man whose confidences I have won, who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have connection with them.
One former slave told Hinton that his mistress ordered him to sleep with her after her husband died. These are just two examples of the many stories abolitionists like Hinton told to prove the immorality of slaveholding. In incidents in the life of a slave girl, Jacobs mentions how planters' daughters would take advantage of male slaves.
They know that the women slaves are subject to their father's authority in all things, and in some cases, they exercise the same authority over the men slaves. I have myself seen the master of such a household whose head was bowed down in shame, for it was known in the neighborhood that his daughter had selected one of the meanest slaves on his plantation to be the father of his first grandchild. She did not make her advances to her equals, meaning white men of high social class, nor even to her father's more intelligent servants. She selected the most brutalized, over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure.
Even if the young white woman in this story did not consider herself a sexual assaulter, which she probably did not, this is clearly sexually predatory behavior. The kind of relationship described here, which Jacob suggests was not uncommon, cannot be classified as consensual in any meaningful sense of the word, and in fact constitutes a form of sexual abuse, if not rape. We thus see that plantation mistresses and elite women, like their male counterparts, were able to sexually control and abuse their slaves. Another way in which white women were able to exercise sexual control over slaves was by threatening to accuse them of rape or attempted rape if they did not agree to sex. In doing this, elite white women used one of the primary instruments of patriarchal repression, the idea that they were weak and in need of white male protection, and by extension, in need of control and domination by white men, to exercise racial control over slaves. Instead of attempting to dismantle the white patriarchal hegemony that oppressed both slaves and, to a lesser extent, white women, predatory white women who coerced slaves into sex through threat of rape, opted to perpetuate both white supremacy and patriarchy by reinforcing paternalistic notions of female sexuality. Why these women chose to sexually abuse slaves probably varied by situation. Perhaps some of them were simply bored or sexually frustrated, but perhaps, at least on a subconscious level, sexually exploiting slaves was a means of compensating for their lack of power in other aspects of their lives. Again, planter-class women were considered the property of their husbands and lacked considerable sexual agency relative to men. It is possible the sexual exploitation of slaves by women who had little power in relation to white men was a source of enjoyment that created a feeling of power. This is not to excuse the actions of these sexually abusive white women, nor is it to suggest that female sexual abuse of slave men would not have occurred had women enjoyed a higher status in society. However, just as slave-owning white women often took out their frustrations on slaves through excessive cruelty and violence, they probably also used sex as a means of domination and control in a society in which they were relatively powerless. In closing, the issue of upper-class white female sex with and sexual abuse of male slaves has not received the scholarly attention it deserves. Odes as White Women, Black Men is the only book on the subject. Most other works on antebellum slaveholding society either mention it in passing or, like Clinton's The Plantation Mistress, dismiss the possibility of upper-class women having sex with slaves. Although such relations were rarer than sex between male masters and slave women, they were no less complicated, problematic, and potentially exploitative, and no less worthy of scholarly analysis. That brings us to the end of yet another eye-opening video. Thank you for watching.
Man, yuck. I mean, so imagine imagine being in that position where a woman who can basically make you do whatever she wants you to do. I think it's more, I'm not gonna say feasible, but it's to make it more real. Think about it today. You get pulled over by the police, and the police say something stupid like "stop resisting," and you're like, "I'm not doing nothing," and they're like, "He's reaching," or something like that. Like, you know, they can say whatever they want, and it can be it's basically law. You know what I'm saying? Like, who gonna dispute it? Who gonna prove differently? It's the word of an officer against somebody that they would deem as a criminal. And even if the criminal is not there, the alleged criminal is not there to defend themselves, to speak up for themselves, then who gonna have anything to say about it? It's a similar situation in this where you could be subject to this woman, and if you don't do what she say, then they gonna sick the dogs on you. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's crazy to think about. It's literally crazy to think about. I mean, same thing now. I talked about the police example. I mean, it's all kind of examples out there, and it don't have to be slave situations. Work situations. You might have a female boss or a female woman that's in charge that you catch her eye, and you're just trying to make a living. You're just trying to earn money to support yourself and your family, and you be in the same position, same situation, same circumstance, and you got to deal with that. It's crazy. It's really crazy. And I know it seemed like to a carnal person, they'll go, "Oh, it's you being with a woman." Like, okay, but if you don't want to be with that woman, but you have to be, you know what I'm saying? Like, you a dog, you a male prostitute, even if it's because you prostituting for your freedom, you prostituting for your employment, you prostituting for whatever it is that this woman is lording over you. You prostituting for, and she has reduced you to a dog. A dog is a male prostitute in the text, and that's what you reduced to. And especially if she married, if she holding over you to be with her, and she got a husband, oh my gosh, that is horrible. I mean, she making you, you know what I'm saying, putting you in a position like that. Now, you know, back in those times, it wasn't that complicated. You just had to do what they said. Otherwise, you'd have to deal with it. But you know, at the same time, he would kill you, and not only would he kill you, he'll kill you in the worst possible method. But he'll probably just, you know, forgive her or whatever the case, and you know, your seed. Who knows what's going to happen to that? Probably be killed as well. But man, that's some heavy stuff. That's some heavy stuff. All right, go ahead. You got something on that?
Yeah, Con, I just real quick, you know, looking at this clip that's left on and the previous video that we covered, you know, we had despite how terrible the conditions were, and you know, despite, you know, the pain that, you know, our ancestors had as being captives here, you know, we had ancestors that survived. All praises to the Most High. You know, it was His grace that brought them through. Like this transatlantic journey, you know, where, you know, a lot of people would perish at sea, you know, and that wasn't the case for at least one of our ancestors, and possibly more than one, you know, but at least one. But all of this that has befallen us, it would have been much easier just to fear the Most High and to keep His commandments.
Indeed, indeed, you know, and you know, you think about it, like, man, those past situations when we read in the text and our people start going off, and it's like, what are you doing? Like, why would you do that? It don't make sense. Like, don't do that. You know, the Most High we're gonna be destroyed for that. You can't do that. But it's like nobody said, you know, one person will come and then they persecute that person, and it's like, man, what is going on? Like, y'all. But here we are years later. Like, if they knew then what we know now, you know, we even went through that situation, those horrible situations, and man, I pray that it was just ignorance, and that, you know, these are what occurred, because truthfully, if you you know, willingly put your people in this situation, I hate to say shame on you, but man, you need to check yourself. You need to check yourself. But that one was so hard. You know, I got to close out. I got to get a little bit of a little bit of an uplift before we close out here, and get a little something going on here.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
You when I'm sitting. Where you when I'm dream? So fast, Kichi, the boy, so fast, Kichi, the daddy, Kichi, Kichima, Kichima, Sibram Kondo, alive, Sibram Kondo, alive, shoot to kill our. Shoot to kill. Come on, sir. Kiss the poor, the farmer. Kiss the poor, The farmer. Attention.
Attention. Been a while since we played that one, but man, this was so heavy today. I had to bring that one out. We needed that one. Oh man. Hard times in the past, hard times currently, and hard times in our future. Jacob's trouble is coming. And all praises to the Abba. He's already told us that we're going to be saved from it. But
that's right.
His way. Can't do it our way. We got to do it his way. And his way is us turning back to him and serving him, spirit and in truth. And that's why we do what we do when we do what we're doing. We always got to keep the Abba in mind. We always got to make sure that we walking to please him in all that we're doing, and all that we're speaking, and all that we're operating in. Because he's promised to save us from the destruction. And after all the mayhem that we've been through, do we really need more destruction? Do we really need more? Like, do you really gotta deal with that? Or can you read the text, or can you hear the word and make up in your mind that you got to operate as the Most High have set forth for us? Because I personally, I choose the Most High. You know what I'm saying? I can't serve anybody but him, because ain't nothing else worth it. You know, the one who did everything and can do anything to me is willing to stand up for me, you know, with his Redeemer. Why would I turn my back on that deal? Like, why would I turn that down? Like, what's another? Who got a better deal to put on the table? There's not one. None exists. None exists, because he's already won. It's already done. So that's all I got. You got anything on that, Doc?
Nah, that's it. That's all I got, Doc.
All praises to the Abba. We'll go ahead and close it out with the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter number 12 and verse number 13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear the Most High and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. It is so very imperative, so very important that we fear the Most High and keep his commandments, because that is the whole duty of man. At the end of the day, when it is all said and done, all the dust is settled, all the smoke is cleared, we will be judged on whether we have feared the Most High and kept his commandments. Why? Because this is the entire reason that we are here. I am Ya'akazaki Yahu, joined by my most esteemed Kenaniah, giving all praises, honor, and great esteem unto the Most High Power, Yahuwah Bahashem, Yahushua HaMashiach, and to the 12 tribes of Israel who are scattered to the four quarters of the earth. I say, Shalom wa Baruchim, that is peace and blessings. And I cannot wait to the day that the Most High brings us back together and we are once again 12 tribes, one family, one nation, under the Most High Power, under one covenant, and back in our own land with a heart of flesh and no more a heart of stone. Until that day come, Shalom, Israel.
Shalom, shalom, Mr. Pakai.
All praises to the